Whenever we're finding the total amount given the percentage of a partial amount, or really any percent amount, we just need to identify what do we know and what is the question we're really asking. So it takes a bit of thinking. In this case, it says a book sold 37,600 copies in the first month of release. Okay, so we're selling a whole bunch of books. Suppose this represents 7.3% of the number of copies sold to date. So in the first month, they sold 7.3% of all the books that they've sold so far. How many copies have been sold to date? So we want to know the total number of copies sold to date, and we know that 7.3% of that number is 37,600. And so I would start to just write that down. I would be like, okay, 7.3%. Remember, when we have percent, we want to add 2 decimal places. Oops. Let's do this. 0.073. See how we moved that to? So 0.073 is the same thing as 7.3%. And so we know that 0.073 times some number, right? You can use X, you can use N, and that is going to equal 37,600. In my head now, I know that the number I'm looking for, the total number of books that I've actually sold, is a bigger number than 37,600. So it needs to be bigger. And 7% is really not very much. 10% of a number is you just take off 1 0. So it's really not going to be that big a number. Anyway, here we go. So we have this 0.073 times X, N, equals 37,600. And if I want to get a number, we could say unmultiply a number, right? If I want to undo this multiplication and get that X by itself, I can divide by the number. When I divide by the number, something divided by itself is just a 1. And so if I did that, I would get 1x. But in the rules of doing little equations, what we do to one side, we have to do exactly the same thing to the other side. And they're probably letting you use a calculator here at this point, because that would be some tricky math. But we know that x is going to equal whatever we get when we do this math. Kind of funny. What's going to happen is that when we divide by this decimal number, we're actually going to get a bigger number. Let me just switch over to their work for a second. Delete that. And we'll look at this. They've done basically the same thing that I just did. You can see, to find how many copies have been sold, we need to answer the following question. 7.3% of, that means times, what number, that means N or X, is means equals 37,600. So they have an equation that looks like what I had. They just haven't changed it until a couple lines down to the 0.073. They have times N equals 37,600, and then they divided by the decimal to get N equals 515,068.49. And if I remember right, the directions said round our answer to the nearest whole number, because we're talking about books, right? Not parts of books. So rounding the nearest whole number, we're going to get N equals 515,068. So I could do something a little bit tricky here. What I could do is I could see if an estimate of this makes sense. 10% is a lot easier for me to think of than 7%. So just for the sake of estimating, I'm going to do this. If I want to do 10% of a number, all I do is slide the decimal this way once. And so 10% of 515,068 is 51,506. 51,506. So I know that 7% is going to be less than 10%. 10% is about 51,000. And so I can go back and remember that our 7.3% was going to be 37,000. That's a pretty good, that sounds pretty good. So it makes sense. So that's the explanation to those. If you can think them out, if you can write a sentence, then you can change your sentence into an equation, And then you can use a little bit of algebra to solve the equation. So let me know if you have any trouble with that.